The air conditioning hummed, somewhere above the stage, invisible and constant, the way it always did in Las Vegas. It was June 1975, and the Hilton showroom held 2,000 people in curved rows of red velvet seats, all of them facing the empty stage like congregants waiting for something they couldn't name. Behind the curtain, in a dressing room that smelled faintly of hairspray and coffee that had gone cold hours ago, Elvis Presley sat alone. He was 40 years old. He wore the white jumpsuit with the blue peacock embroidery, the one that had fit perfectly 18 months ago and now pulled slightly at the shoulders. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes were closed. He wasn't praying, exactly. He wasn't meditating. He was just sitting in the only silence he would get for the next 90 minutes, breathing through his nose, trying to remember why he still did this. 2 shows a night, 7 nights a week, the same songs in roughly the same order, the same jokes between numbers, the same standing ovations that felt somehow like they were meant for someone else. He could hear the orchestra warming up through the walls, the muffled brass, the scattered piano scales, the low murmur of the audience settling into their seats with their cocktails and their cameras and their expectations. Something felt different tonight. He couldn't place it. It wasn't the venue. He'd played this room hundreds of times. It wasn't the set list. It wasn't the backup singers, or the band, or the lighting cues. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. But there was a weight in his chest that he couldn't shake, a tiredness that went deeper than sleep. He'd felt it for months now, maybe longer. The sense that he was going through motions he'd perfected so long ago that his body could do them without his mind being present at all. He opened his eyes and looked at the mirror. The face that looked back at him was still handsome, still recognizable, but there were shadows under the eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. There were lines at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His hair was still jet black, still swept back in the style that had become his signature, but there was something behind the eyes that photographs never captured. A knock at the door. 5 minutes, Mr. Presley. He didn't answer. He just stood up slowly and walked toward the door. The walk from dressing room to stage was 47 steps. He'd counted them once, years ago, in a moment of boredom that had turned into ritual. 47 steps through a narrow hallway lined with cables and equipment cases, past the backup singers in their matching gowns, past the security guards in their dark suits, past the stagehand who would hand him the microphone at exactly the right moment. 47 steps to become someone else, or maybe to become the person everyone expected him to be. He wasn't sure anymore which one was real. The orchestra launched into the opening fanfare. The brass hit that iconic chord progression that had been announcing his entrance for years. The audience erupted before he even stepped into the light. Ladies and gentlemen, the Hilton International Hotel is proud to present. He walked out. The spotlight found him immediately, hot and white and absolute. He raised one hand in a half wave, the gesture automatic, and the screaming doubled. 2,000 people on their feet, camera flashes popping like tiny explosions in the darkness beyond the stage, hands reaching toward him from the front rows. He smiled. It was a good smile. It had been called the most famous smile in the world. It had launched 1,000 magazine covers, 100 movies, 1,000,000 dreams. He'd learned to summon it on command decades ago, back when he was 19 years old and terrified and everything was happening so fast he could barely breathe. Now the smile came easy, too easy. It was just another part of the costume. He took the microphone from the stand and waited for the noise to settle. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." His voice came back at him through the monitors, deep and smooth and confident. The crowd screamed again. He'd learned that waiting was its own kind of power. "It's good to be here with you tonight." They cheered. He launched into the opening number, something up-tempo, something that would get them moving and clapping, and remind them that this was supposed to be a celebration. The band was tight. The backup singers hit every harmony. His voice was strong, stronger than it had any right to be given how little sleep he'd gotten. But somewhere in the middle of the second verse, his eyes drifted to the audience. He always scanned the crowd. It was habit by now. He looked for the beautiful women, the enthusiastic dancers, the men who'd been dragged there by their wives and were now secretly having the time of their lives. He looked for the faces that would give him something to play to, something to connect with, and that's when he saw her. She was in the third row, just left of center. A small girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair pulled back from her face in 2 uneven braids. She was sitting in one of the velvet chairs, her feet dangling above the floor because she wasn't tall enough for them to reach. She wasn't standing, she wasn't clapping, she wasn't screaming or waving or trying to get his attention. She was just watching him. There was something about her stillness that cut through everything else in the room. While 2,000 people moved and swayed and reached toward the stage, this one small girl sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel, for just a moment, like he was actually being seen. He finished the song, the applause washed over him, he smiled and waved and did all the things he was supposed to do, but his eyes kept drifting back to the third row. Next to the girl sat a woman who must have been her mother. She was maybe 35, with the same dark hair and the same quiet face. She was watching the show, but her hand rested on the girl's shoulder in a way that seemed protective, almost apologetic. And that's when Elvis noticed the tubes. They were thin and transparent, running from somewhere behind the girl's ears down to a small device in her lap. Oxygen. A portable oxygen concentrator, the kind that hummed and clicked and kept people breathing when their lungs couldn't do the job alone. The girl wasn't moving because she couldn't. He missed the opening of the next song by half a beat. The band covered for him seamlessly. No one in the audience noticed, but he noticed. He noticed everything now. He kept singing. Love Me Tender came third in the set, the way it always did. It was a slow song, a quiet song, the kind that let him walk to the edge of the stage and look out at the faces in the front rows. He'd given away 1,000 scarves during this song. He'd kissed 1,000 cheeks. He'd whispered 1,000 sweet nothings to women who would remember the moment for the rest of their lives. Tonight he walked to the edge of the stage and looked at the girl. She was still watching him, still perfectly still. Her mother's hand still rested on her shoulder, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Elvis felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was easy. Pity was what you felt for people whose problems you could walk away from. This was something else. This was recognition. He saw in that small, still face a tiredness that matched his own. Not the tiredness of a long day or a sleepless night. The tiredness of carrying something heavy for so long that you'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. The song ended. The applause came. He stepped back from the edge of the stage and ran through the rest of the first set on autopilot. The up-tempo numbers, the crowd pleasers, the karate kicks and the cape twirls and all the theatrical flourishes that had become expected of him. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. During the 15-minute intermission, he stood in the wings and drank water and tried to understand what he was feeling. Charlie, his road manager, appeared at his elbow with a towel and a concerned expression. "You okay, boss? You seemed a little distracted out there." Elvis didn't answer for a long moment. "There's a little girl in the third row," he said finally. "Dark hair, braids. She's got an oxygen tank or something." Charlie nodded slowly. "I saw her. What about her? Find out who she is. Find out why she's here." Charlie knew better than to ask questions when Elvis used that tone. He disappeared into the backstage shadows, and Elvis was alone again. The second set started. He sang. He moved. He gave the audience what they'd paid for. But between songs, in those quiet moments when the applause faded and the band waited for his cue, his eyes kept finding their way to the third row. The girl was still there, still watching, still absolutely motionless, except for the slight rise and fall of her small chest as the machine in her lap pushed oxygen into her lungs. Halfway through Suspicious Minds, Charlie appeared at the side of the stage and caught Elvis's eye. He made a small gesture that meant, "I have information." Elvis finished the song, took a bow, and walked to the wings. "Her name's Maria," Charlie said quietly. "Maria Gonzalez. She's 9 years old. She has something called cystic fibrosis. The doctors say." He hesitated. "Say what?" "They say she won't see her 10th birthday. Her mom works 2 jobs. This concert was—" Charlie paused, choosing his words carefully. "It was Maria's dying wish. Her church took up a collection to pay for the tickets." Elvis stood very still. The noise of the audience washed over him. The band was vamping, waiting for him to return, filling time with instrumental flourishes. The backup singers were shooting nervous glances toward the wings, but Elvis didn't move. "Her dying wish," he repeated. "Yeah, and she just wanted to see a concert. She just wanted to see you." Something happened in Elvis's chest then. Something cracked open that he'd been keeping closed for months, maybe years. He'd seen a lot of fans in his life. He'd met people who loved him more than they loved their own families. He'd been worshipped and adored and put on a pedestal so high he couldn't breathe. But this was different. This small girl with the oxygen tank and the quiet eyes wasn't asking him to be a legend. She wasn't asking him to be perfect or powerful or larger than life. She was just asking him to be there, to be real, to be something worth seeing before the world took even that away from her. And in that moment, Elvis realized something that hit him like a blow to the chest. He'd been so tired of being Elvis Presley that he'd forgotten what it meant. He'd been so exhausted by the expectations and the costumes and the endless performances that he'd lost touch with why any of it mattered in the first place. But this girl, this small, still dying girl in the third row, she hadn't come to see a legend. She'd come to see a man who could make her feel something. She'd come to see someone who could give her, for just one night, something worth holding on to. And he'd been up there on that stage, going through the motions, giving her nothing but a performance. Elvis walked back onto the stage, The audience cheered. The band launched into the next number. Everything was normal. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But halfway through the song, Elvis stopped singing. The band faltered. The backup singers exchanged confused glances. 2,000 people fell silent, unsure what was happening. Elvis stood at the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, looking out at the third row. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was soft. Not the smooth, confident voice he used for performing. Just his voice, the one that had come from Memphis. The one that remembered poverty and loss, and what it felt like to want something so badly you could taste it. "I need to do something." He stepped off the stage. There was no security barrier between the stage and the front rows. There never was at the Hilton. Just a few feet of empty space, and then the velvet seats and the startled faces of the audience. Elvis walked through that space like a man walking through water. The audience on either side of him reached out, trying to touch him, trying to grab a piece of his costume, trying to claim a moment they could tell their friends about later. But he didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge any of them. He walked directly to the third row, directly to the seat where Maria Gonzalez sat with her oxygen tank and her quiet eyes, and he knelt down in front of her. The showroom went absolutely silent. 2,000 people held their breath. The band had stopped playing. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Elvis looked at Maria. Up close she was smaller than he'd thought. Her skin had a faint grayish tinge that spoke of hospitals and treatments, and too many days spent indoors. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they held none of the worship or hysteria that he usually saw in fans' faces. She was just looking at him, like he was a person, like he was real. "Hi," Elvis said softly. "What's your name?" Her voice was barely a whisper. The oxygen hissed quietly between her words. "Maria. That's a beautiful name." He reached out and took her small hand in his. It was cool and dry and impossibly light. "I'm Elvis." "I know." He smiled. Not the stage smile, not the magazine cover smile. Just a smile. The kind of smile that one person gives another when words aren't enough. "Are you enjoying the show?" She nodded slowly. "What's your favorite song?" She thought about it for a moment. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was too fast and too light. "Can't Help Falling in Love," she said finally. Elvis felt something tighten in his throat. That song. That particular song. The one he'd written off as too sentimental, too cliched, too overplayed. The one he'd performed thousands of times without really hearing the words. But hearing it come from this small girl's lips, in that small whisper of a voice, it sounded like something entirely different. It sounded like a prayer. "I was going to sing that one later," Elvis said, "but I think maybe I'll sing it now, if that's okay with you." Maria nodded. Elvis didn't stand up. He didn't walk back to the stage. He didn't reclaim his microphone from the stand or signal the band to start playing. He just stayed there, on his knees, in front of a dying girl in the third row, and he started to sing. His voice came out soft and unaccompanied, rough around the edges in a way it never was during performances. There was no backing track, no orchestration, no theatrical arrangement, just his voice, filling the silence of that massive room, singing words that suddenly meant something again. Wise men say only fools rush in. Maria's mother had tears streaming down her face. She made no move to wipe them away. "But I can't help falling in love with you." The audience sat in absolute stillness. No one reached for a camera. No one tried to capture the moment. They understood, instinctively, that something sacred was happening, something that didn't belong to them, something that belonged only to the small girl with the oxygen tank and the man in the white jumpsuit who had stopped being a legend and started being human again. "Shall I stay? Would it be a sin?" Elvis felt tears prick at his own eyes. He didn't fight them. He didn't try to maintain his composure, or protect his image, or be anything other than what he was in that moment, a tired man, singing to a dying child, trying to give her something worth having. "If I can't help falling in love with you." Maria's small hand tightened slightly around his. Her eyes were bright, not with excitement or worship, but with something quieter and more profound. Understanding. She understood. She understood what it cost him to be here, on his knees, in front of all these people. She understood that he was giving her something real, something true, something that had nothing to do with fame or fortune, or all the trappings of success. And in that understanding she gave him something back. She gave him permission to be tired, permission to be uncertain, permission to be human. "Take my hand, take my whole life too." His voice cracked on the high note. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he didn't care what anyone thought of his performance. He wasn't performing. He was just singing, the way he'd sung in his mother's kitchen when he was small, the way he'd sung in the little church in Memphis before anyone knew his name, the way he'd sung before singing became a job and a burden and a thing he did because he didn't know how to do anything else. "For I can't help falling in love with you." The song ended. The silence held for a long suspended moment. Then Maria smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, just a slight upward turn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her entire face. It made her look for just a moment like any other 9-year-old girl,
healthy, happy, whole. Elvis reached up and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't ask why he was thanking her. She didn't need to. She understood. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting from the minutes he'd spent on the floor. He looked at Maria's mother, at the tears still streaming down her face. After the show, he said quietly, "Come backstage. Ask for Charlie. He'll take care of you." She nodded, unable to speak. Elvis turned and walked back to the stage. The audience parted for him like water. When he climbed back up into the spotlight, when he reclaimed his microphone, when he nodded at the band to start playing again, something had shifted. The rest of the concert was different. It wasn't that he sang better, or moved more energetically, or delivered a more polished performance. If anything, he was rougher, less controlled, more prone to unexpected pauses and unrehearsed moments. But there was something alive in him now that hadn't been there before. When he sang American Trilogy, his voice broke on the line about dying. He didn't try to hide it. He let the break hang in the air, let the audience feel the weight of it, and then he kept going. When he sang How Great Thou Art, he closed his eyes and tilted his face toward the lights and sang like he was trying to reach someone far away. When he reached the encore, the traditional closing of Can't Help Falling in Love, he paused before starting. "I already sang this one tonight," he said into the microphone, "but I'm going to sing it again, because some songs are worth singing twice." He looked at Maria in the third row. She was still there, still watching, still smiling, that small, quiet smile. He sang it again. When the concert ended, when the final bow was taken, and the house lights came up and the audience filed out into the Las Vegas night, Elvis went backstage and found Charlie waiting with Maria and her mother. They sat in his dressing room for an hour. He didn't perform for them. He didn't try to be entertaining or charming or larger than life. He just talked about his mother, who had died 17 years ago and whom he still missed every day, about Memphis, about the little house on Audubon Drive, about the way the world had been before everything got so complicated. Maria listened. She didn't say much. Her voice was too weak for extended conversation, and the oxygen tank hummed quietly beside her chair. But she listened with those dark, understanding eyes, and Elvis found himself saying things he hadn't said to anyone in years. He told her about being scared, about lying awake at night wondering if any of it meant anything, about feeling like he was slowly disappearing inside a character he'd created and couldn't escape. Maria nodded like she understood, and somehow, impossibly, he believed she did. Before they left, Elvis pressed something into Maria's hand. It was a ring, not one of the flashy stage rings with the big stones and the ostentatious settings, a simple gold band with a small ruby that had belonged to his mother. "This was Gladys's," he said. "I want you to have it." Maria's mother tried to protest, but Elvis shook his head. "It belongs with her now," he said. "I don't know why. It just does." They left. Charlie escorted them out through a back entrance to avoid the crowd still lingering in the casino. Elvis sat alone in his dressing room for a long time after they were gone. The weight in his chest was still there. The tiredness hadn't disappeared. He knew that tomorrow night he would have to go back out on that stage and do it all over again. He knew that the world would keep expecting things from him that he wasn't sure he could deliver. But something was different now. He'd been reminded of something he'd forgotten, not why he sang exactly. The reasons for that had become tangled and complicated over the years, woven together with obligation and habit and the simple fact that he didn't know how to do anything else. But he'd been reminded what it could mean, what a song could do for someone who needed it, what showing up, really showing up, could mean to a person who didn't have much time left. He looked at himself in the mirror again. The same face, the same shadows under the eyes, the same lines at the corners of the mouth. But something behind the eyes was different. There was a light there that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and he'd just stopped looking for it. Maria Gonzalez died 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in September. She was 9 years old. Elvis found out from Charlie, who had kept in touch with Maria's mother. He didn't cry when he heard the news. He just sat very still for a long time, staring at a spot on the wall, his hands folded in his lap the same way Maria's hands had been folded that night in the third row. He performed that night. He never missed a show if he could help it. But during Can't Help Falling in Love, he stopped in the middle of the song and looked out at the audience. "This one's for Maria," he said. Then he finished the song. No one in the audience knew who Maria was. No one understood the reference. But something in his voice made them listen harder, made them feel for just a moment like they were part of something larger than a concert. Over the next 2 years, people who knew Elvis well noticed something. He was still tired, still struggling with the same demons he'd been fighting for years. The weight fluctuated, the performances were inconsistent, the good nights alternated with the not-so-good nights. But there were moments when he would stop in the middle of a song and really look at someone in the audience. Moments when he would walk to the edge of the stage and take someone's hand and sing directly to them. Moments when the legend would slip away and the person underneath would shine through. His backup singers talked about it afterward. Something changed in him. one of them said. I don't know what happened or when, but there was a night when something shifted. He started looking at people differently, like he was actually seeing them. The Stamps Quartet, who sang gospel backup for Elvis in his later years, remembered it too. He used to phone it in sometimes, J.D. Sumner said. We all did. It was hard not to, doing the same show night after night. But there toward the end, there were these moments when he'd suddenly be right there, present, like he remembered why he was doing this. Elvis never talked about Maria publicly. He never told the story of that night in Las Vegas to interviewers or biographers. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain to someone who wasn't there. But Maria's mother told people, not right away, not while she was still grieving, but years later, when the pain had softened into something more like gratitude. She started sharing what had happened. She told people about the night Elvis Presley stopped his concert and knelt down in front of her dying daughter. She told them about the song he sang, unaccompanied, in that massive silent room. She told them about the ring he gave Maria, the one that had belonged to his mother, the one that Maria wore every day until she died. The story spread quietly, the way true stories do. It passed from person to person, from church to church, from one grieving parent to another. It became part of the informal folklore that surrounded Elvis's memory, not the official narrative of hit records and sold-out concerts, but the other story, the one about who he was when the cameras weren't rolling. After Elvis died in August 1977, Maria's mother wrote a letter. She addressed it to Graceland, not knowing if anyone would read it or what would happen to it. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't want recognition or money, or any piece of the Elvis industry that had grown up around his memory. She just wanted someone to know. She wanted someone to know that on a night in June 1975, in a showroom in Las Vegas, a tired man in a white jumpsuit had stopped being a legend long enough to become a person, that he had knelt down in front of a small girl with an oxygen tank and sung to her like she was the only person in the world, that he had given her something worth having in the short time she had left, and that Maria, in her own quiet way, had given him something too: permission to be tired, permission to be uncertain, permission to be human. The letter arrived at Graceland 3 weeks after it was sent. It was read by someone on staff and passed around until it ended up in a box with other correspondence that seemed too important to throw away but too private to make public. It's probably still there. Years passed, decades passed. Elvis became an industry, an icon, a figure so thoroughly mythologized that the man underneath seemed to disappear entirely. His face appeared on postage stamps and velvet paintings and cheap souvenirs sold in airport gift shops. His music was covered and sampled and reinterpreted in ways he never could have imagined. But every now and then someone would tell the story of Maria. They'd tell it in fan clubs and at conventions. They'd tell it in the comments sections of YouTube videos, and in late-night conversations between people who had loved Elvis not for what he represented, but for who he'd been. And every time the story was told, something interesting happened. People didn't talk about how impressive it was. They didn't marvel at the grand gesture or the theatrical moment. They didn't treat it as evidence of Elvis's generosity or his kindness or his larger-than-life personality. They talked about how small it was, how quiet, how human. They talked about a tired man who had forgotten why he did what he did. A dying girl who had just wanted to see something real before she ran out of time, and the moment when those two people met in the silence between songs and reminded each other what it meant to be alive. That's the story. Not the legend, not the myth, not the cultural phenomenon, or the rock and roll revolution, or any of the grand narratives that have been built around Elvis Presley's memory. Just a story about two people, one who was tired of living in a spotlight, one who knew she wouldn't be living much longer at all, and the song that passed between them on a night in Las Vegas, when the music stopped and the silence held, and something true happened in a room full of strangers. Maria Gonzalez would have been 59 years old this year. She would have lived to see the end of the millennium, the rise of the internet, the emergence of a world so different from the one she left behind, that she might not have recognized it. But she died at 9 years old, with a gold and ruby ring on her finger, and the memory of a song in her heart. And Elvis Presley, who had another 2 years of life ahead of him, spent those years a little differently, because of her. Not perfectly, not without struggle, not without the same demons, and the same doubts, and the same crushing weight of expectation that had been slowly suffocating him for years, but differently, with moments when he stopped and really looked, moments when he stepped off the stage and into the audience and became, for just a few minutes, a person instead of a performance, moments when the legend fell away and the man underneath emerged, tired and uncertain, and utterly beautifully human. Those moments were his legacy, not the hit records, not the movies, not the costumes, or the mansions, or the screaming crowds. The moments, the ones that happened when no one was taking pictures, the ones that passed from person to person like secrets, the ones that reminded people why any of it mattered in the first place. Maria gave him that. A 9-year-old girl with an oxygen tank and quiet eyes. She gave him permission to stop, to kneel, to sing, to be seen. And in that gift, in that small and quiet and utterly human exchange, something true was created, something that outlasted both of them, something that still echoes in the silence between songs, in the pauses between words, in the moments when performance falls away and connection takes its place. That's what matters. Not the legend, the moment, the silence, the song.